A native of Montreal, Andrew Cohen attended McGill and Cambridge universities. Among his best-selling books are Trudeau's Shadow, The Life and Legacy of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, The Unfinished Canadian, and While Canada Slept, How We Lost Our Place in the World, a finalist for the Governor-General's Literary Award. A former foreign correspondent and award-winning editorialist with the Globe and Mail, he writes a weekly syndicated column. He is a professor of journalism and international affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa, where he lives with his wife, son, and daughter. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start with the cover of the book. We're talking about Lester B. Pearson, the book that you wrote as part of the Extraordinary Canadians series that Penguin has been publishing over the last couple of years. The painting of him on the cover, it makes him look like he's concerned, he's worried, he's quite the opposite of the picture that you paint of him in the book. Why is that?
Damned if I know. The covers were commissioned for the series, independent of the books themselves, which is not a criticism because I think they're wonderful covers by wonderful artists. I think he looks a bit like Mao. You're right, there's an anxiety, there's a, Nigel, as you say, there's a concern that he had, but would belie the rather exuberant, jaunty, optimistic Mike being the nickname that he carried from the Great War through life.
In fact, you mentioned that he had what could have been classified as a nervous breakdown, as anyone with any kind of feeling probably would, given what he had to face in the First World War.
Well, his war experience is interesting because probably he served longer in the military than any other prime minister, certainly in the 20th century. And he goes off to war as an enthusiastic son of the empire. He enrolls at 18 years old in 1915. As soon as he can, he enrolls. And he joins the University of Toronto Medical Corps and begins life on the slower Eastern Front in Salonika. He wants to be transferred out of there because he thinks there's not enough of a war for him, that he, at a time that people were pulling all kinds of strings to get out of the fight, he wants to get in it, and he's transferred to the Western Front. But before he can get there, he says, I'm going to be a flyer. He learns to fly, but he never sees combat on the Western Front because he goes up in one of these, they were nothing more than motorized box kites, held together by elastic bands and glue. He has an accident. He's put in a hospital. And on leave, he steps in front of a bus on Edgware Road in London, and he's not cold, and he has to recover. It's then that, as he contemplates the war in conversation with others, that he begins to wonder, this is 1917, what this was all about. And it's then that we believe that he had something akin to a nervous breakdown when he's both recovering but gets back to Canada. He never was what I would call a war profiteer. He never wanted to talk about the war. He never, as a politician, would exaggerate his war experience. It was something he did, and he said, I survived it.
Yeah, there's a lovely little quote, and incidentally, throughout the book, there are all sorts of really pleasing snippets and lines that you've either taken from his writing or you've developed yourself. But there's one that says, here, I got hurt before I got a chance to get killed.
Right. Nigel, it's important to understand the character of this man. He was, at his core, modest. His background was modest. He didn't come from money. He came from a loving, some would call a family in genteel poverty. His father was a clergyman. They moved from parish to parish across Ontario, both central and southern Ontario. He had a wonderful childhood, but not a wealthy one. And modesty was sewn into the virtues of being the son of a monks. And that's the way he was raised. And it was the modesty and the sunniness of his life, which goes back to why you're asking about the portrait. And again, that's an artist's license, I guess.
Well, yeah, and also there's some complexity too, isn't there?
There is complexity. And yes, and people think, you look at his career and he says, as his life ending, he said, I've been lucky. I've had many lives, more lives than a cat. And he says, I've been lucky in all of them. He had more lives. This man was an athlete. He was a soldier. He was a teacher. Of course, he was a student. He was a diplomat. He was a politician. He was a writer. He had many lives. And he was successful in all of them. And what I try and capture in this book are the nature of those lives, because people forget, perhaps, that long before Lester Pearson became Prime Minister, he was a successful opposition leader. Before that, he was a successful Minister of External Affairs. Before that, he was a diplomat, and he was perhaps the best-known Canadian in the world in the 1940s. The subject of glowing testimonials and articles in the international press.
And he was also approached frequently to lead various international organizations, wasn't he?
He was, even up to the time he was a politician, in 1958, when he had become leader of the Liberal Party in the fall of 1957. And by the way, his leadership of the Liberal Party is perhaps his most unacknowledged success, because he takes a devastated Liberal Party, and by the way, he had a lot to do with its devastation by having been, badly misadvised and forced an election, and John Diefenbaker just crushes him.
Walter Gordon advised him.
Walter Gordon and others misadvised him, really.
Yeah.
Misadvised him. I think it was largely Pickersgill too, Jack Pickersgill, and said, you can bring them down. We've been out of power 6 months, and the country's ready to bring us back. And they weren't ready, and that was a hubris and an arrogance which didn't serve him well. However, having done that, he begins. And there are always lessons for our time, Nigel, and how you, if Michael Ignatieff wanted a blueprint of how you rebuild a party and lead it back to power when it's on its knees, Mike Pearson provides that in the years 58 to 63.
But bringing in a lot of brilliant young men.
But in reference to what you said about his opportunities, when the returns were coming in on March 31st, 1958, and there was really no polling then, so you didn't really know how you were going to do until the people voted. And it looks pretty bad. He and his wife, Marion, are at the Chateau Laurier, and the returns are coming in, and it's a devastating loss. The Liberals have been reduced to 40 seats.
The lowest at that point in history, right, for them.
Or 48, I can't remember, but between 40 and 48 seats. And John Diefenbaker had run up the largest parliamentary majority in Canadian history. And he's facing this devastation. His wife turns to him and he said, "Mike, we've lost everything. You've even won your seat."
Yeah.
And what she was saying was, now you got to do this job. Well, around this time, he had been offered to head the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, which was a charitable organization, at what was then a six-figure salary. A six-figure salary in 1958, if you do the math, is a lot of money today. And he said no. Against the request or the will of his wife, he said no.
Was that any connection with King's relationship with the Rockefellers?
I don't think so, but maybe, it's interesting you should say that.
So maybe he could try to get rid of Pearson.
Yeah, maybe. I hadn't thought of the relationship, because you're right, King had been associated. Whatever it was, he had other opportunities. He was a Nobel laureate. He had won the Nobel Prize in 1957, which assured that he would be leader of the Liberal Party. And he takes it on, and he says that I am going to, despite the withering attacks that come across the aisle every day from John Diefenbaker, a practiced parliamentarian. Mike Pearson was not a practiced parliamentarian. He wasn't good at that. He was a diplomat. He was temperamentally a diplomat, emotionally a diplomat. And John Diefenbaker was a practiced politician. So there would be this low, guttural catfight across the floor of the House of Commons. And this went on from 1958 largely, or 1957, to 1967, roughly. And these two were at the forefront of Canadian politics, John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson, in different positions. One as Prime Minister, then they switched positions, and one became leader of the opposition. And until Dief was forced out in 67, that was the reality of Canadian politics. But Mike Pearson does rebuild the party.
You quote him as saying that his experience in one of the elections, I think, that they won, it was one of the worst experiences of his life.
Yeah.
So as you say, he's clearly not built to be aggressive in the trenches like Diefenbaker was. But the series only allows your take, if you will, on this man, as opposed to anything in depth. But you don't really get into the relationship between Diefenbaker and Pearson. And I wonder if you could just talk to that a little bit.
Well, I think they hated each other.
Yeah, Diefenbaker, when Pearson was on his deathbed, said we need to pray for him.
Yes, he
and
did.
He did.
He did. Diefenbaker was a complex guy. Mike Pearson didn't hate anybody, and I've used a strong word. But he thought Diefenbaker was untrustworthy. He had a bon ami, Mike Pearson. It's why he, when he met Jack Kennedy, they immediately, in the parlance of today, bonded. They liked each other. Kennedy was so happy to see Pearson after having dealt with Diefenbaker, because Kennedy couldn't stand Diefenbaker. It reminded him of the worst Western populists. He had never any use for them in the United States. Mrs. Pearson, Marion Pearson, always referred to John Diefenbaker as that bad man. They didn't like the way John Diefenbaker conducted himself, because John Diefenbaker took no prisoners. He was, as I said, a fierce, practiced rhetorician and parliamentarian. And Mike Pearson, though he had been in Parliament longer than John Diefenbaker, most of those years, in fact, all of those years until between 1948, when he enters the House of Commons and becomes Minister of External Affairs, he had the most glorious and seamless rise into politics. He's recruited by the Liberal Party. A seat is found for him, and the candidate, the occupant, the incumbent, is moved to the Senate, and the riding is prepared, and it's all done the way the Liberal Party did things in those days, and they win another majority. And Mike Pearson moves from being the top man, the Undersecretary of State at External Affairs, to be the Minister of External Affairs. After having been a diplomat from 1928 to 1948, suddenly he's a politician. But in those years, 48 to 58 or 48 to 57, he's Minister of External Affairs, and he isn't part of the cut and thrust of Parliament because he's away. He's at the UN. He would decamp for the UN, and it seemed like he would spend weeks there, which is why he was so successful there. He knew everybody.
And everyone liked him.
Everybody liked him. And he had been known long before that. What people don't know about Mike Pearson is that he was at the forefront of much of the creation of the post-war world. His proudest achievement, he was there for the UN, of course, and he was there for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and he was there for the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Yeah. But his proudest achievement, as you say, Nigel, is NATO. And he said that
not the Suez.
Well, in terms of creating something, no, okay. I think he'll even say NATO was more important to him than Suez. He saw Suez, which is his finest hour, and it is at Suez that all that he's learned, and all that he knows, and everywhere he's been, and everyone he's met, all come together in this extraordinary application of politesse and finesse and diplomacy. It all happens in the fall of 1956.
It's so fascinating how it places Canada exactly where it needs to be, that we've got France, we've got Britain, and we've got the United States. And it's so typical of Pearson's life as you paint it. He's at the right place at the right time, and opportunity presents itself and he seizes it.
Well, and the word luck, he'll say, I've had 9 lives, more than again, I've been lucky in all of them. But it isn't just luck. No. And I talk about that. And it may be a cliche to talk about hockey, but, the best hockey players are those who not so much know where the puck is, but they know where it's going. And so he makes decisions. People said in the 1930s, maybe you ought to go to Japan. Because, you could have a career in Japan. He says, I'm not going to Japan. I'm going to be where the action is. The action is in Europe. Later on, the 1940s, they say, you can go to Brazil if you would like to. He said, I'm not going to Latin America. I'm going to leave London and go to Washington. And so he makes decisions. When he turns 50, he looks back on a life. He'll still have a lot, he'll have another quarter century or more. But he looks back on a life in which it hasn't been about just luck. He's made his luck. He's gone to where the puck is going to be. And by the way, the hockey analogy is not wasted on Mike Pearson because he's a great athlete. And one thing Canadians don't know about Mike Pearson is he was a great athlete. He did play semi-professional baseball.
Well, there's another great line that you use. He says, I'm the only diplomat that was paid to play baseball.
That's right. He plays baseball after the Great War. In fact, he organizes baseball games in the field, so to speak, in Europe. And he comes back, I think it's the summer of 1919, and he plays, I think it's with the Guelph semi-professional ball. Yeah. Then he goes to Oxford, which is a golden period for him in 1921, and he plays for the Oxford team. And they call him in Europe, he plays in Switzerland, they call him Herr Zigzag, because he was so good with the puck. And he's offered, he doesn't take it, Nigel, but he's offered a place on the Olympic team, on the British Olympic team, interestingly enough. Loves sports, and I spent a lot of time with his late son, Jeffrey. And Jeffrey always said to me, himself, by the way, a renowned Canadian diplomat, Jeff always said, you ought to talk about my father as a sportsman. And the book opens on the second floor of Laurier House in Ottawa, which is a National Historic Site, the home of Laurier and then of King. And through an accident, there's a little museum there, a little room there, which is a replica of Mike Pearson's office. His basement office, which he used in retirement when he left Sussex Drive in 1968, the last 4 years of his life, what was a basement office, which looked like, by the way, as I say, a rec room in Sudbury. I mean, it was nothing special about it, but it's adorned with ribbons and plaques and bowls and trophies. He took up rugby in Britain, and he wins the award as one of the finest rugby players.
He gets mentioned in the Times.
Yeah, he gets mentioned. You know the book better than I. Right up to the time he was Prime Minister, he took part in softball games, which took place in front of Parliament Hill. You know, the press gallery would play the MPs in those days. So sporting life is very important to Mike Pearson. The only thing he couldn't do well was swim. And so Jeffrey said, never want him near water because he just wasn't a natural swimmer.
You make the point, too, I love this here, that the team, this Oxford expat team, was so strong, it beat Cambridge 27-0.
I know. You know why? Of course, the whole team was Canadians. He goes to, again, another life. He leaves Oxford, which he calls glorious years at Oxford. He's there for 2 years. And he's having a very good time. And that's where he plays for Oxford. He goes to Switzerland and his hair zigzag and he plays hockey. But he returns home and he gets what he wants. And what he wants is, he wants to teach at the University of Toronto. He wants to teach in the Department of History. People like Donald Creighton are there and others are there. Some of the giants who would become part of the Canadian school. And he says there, he's teaching, and he says, I was coaching there, but my coaching only took up 3 hours a day. He says that. He said coaching only took up 3 hours a day. And they offered him, in 1928, he's writing the examination for this fledgling Department of External Affairs, as it was then called, and Odie Skelton has been given a mandate in 1925 to make something of it. It existed since 1909, but it really wasn't much. And he's recruiting. So Mike Pearson goes up to Ottawa, and he's got this acceptance. He goes up to Ottawa. At the very same time, U of T comes back to him and says, how'd you like to be the football coach? And he's tempted because he loves sports, and Marion says, your future is not as a football coach. But it just shows the variety of his life. And everything he does, he brings enormous energy. You don't get to be the kind of person he was if you're lazy. So the only 3 hours a day for football, much as he loved it, was part of a life in which he threw himself into everything, and no more so than when he was a diplomat.
Well, he also, as you say, he embraces almost every situation that he's in. Again, back in the First World War, it's awful, and he finds it awful, but he also finds it fascinating.
He does. He has a good war, First World War, in the sense that his mother says, I'm so worried about you. You were so sickly as a kid, and the moment your feet get wet, you're going to be sick. And he's never sick. He said he actually felt guilty. He said, I feel ridiculously healthy. He had arranged. He knew the right people. He knew the right quartermaster, and he found ways to improve his situation, as soldiers did there. Better food, better clothing. Nothing untoward, but simply the way you work the system to do certain things. But he said at a time there was blackwater fever and there was dysentery and typhoid, and soldiers are dropping like flies, and the winters are cold and they've gone with summer uniforms because they weren't well equipped. Mike says, I'm having a good war. And I think it was that guilt that, by the way, that drove him to join the Western Front. And you know something? If he hadn't have been in the Royal Flying Corps and had that accident, he probably would have gone to the Somme, where his brother had been. That probably would have been the end of him. Because, as we know, it was a slaughterhouse. Well, and he knew that.
And his brother, too, was psychologically damaged.
Yeah, his brother really, he had two brothers.
Neither of which he was close to, which is, again, kind of contradictory. Well, he's very friendly, but maybe he's much more private and less sociable in his real life.
The biographer always looks for friends. Who are his friends? And the Reagan biographers are always looking for friends. I'm writing on the Kennedys now, and it's no problem identifying Jack Kennedy's close friends. But for some people, like Mike Pearson, it is hard to identify his closest friends because, he was very generous, but there was something of a competition between Norman Robertson and him. And Norman Robertson was, entered the department just about a year apart, but Norman Robertson from Vancouver, an economist, had gone to Oxford. less successfully than Mike, didn't like it as much as Mike did. In 1941, when Odie Skelton drops dead, and Mike Pearson is in London, Mackenzie King makes Norman Robertson the number 2. Leapfrogs
right?
over. He's 6 years younger, and he's joined the department later. And Mike Pearson, to his great credit, I mean, he wanted the job, and he was hurt.
It was a big disappointment, wasn't it?
Big disappointment, but he gives a speech, and he said, let no tongues wag in Ottawa over this. I mean, this is the choice. And he serves Norman Robertson very well. But were they close friends? Yeah, I mean, I describe in While Canvas Slept, Norman Robertson and Hugh Wrong, they're buried beside each other in McLaren's cemetery.
Where's that?
It's in Wakefield. But I opened While Canvas Slept with this image of the three of them walking.
Which incidentally has been nominated for one of the best books of the best history book of the last 25
best
years?
political book of the last 25 years. So I'm very honored by that. But they're wandering in the Gatineau Hills, and we think it's the 40s, but we're not sure. And they come across this old cemetery, a 19th century graveyard, just above Wakefield. And those days, Wakefield was a distance from Ottawa, though there were 6 trains a day from Ottawa that pulled into the station. Now we don't sustain any. We have a little tourist train which breaks down all the time. Right. But in those days, and it could take, the roads were so rudimentary, it could take you 3 hours to get up to where they were. But they were walking, and they find this magnificent cemetery. And I remember so well when I first saw it. And they had this very romantic view that they're all going to be buried there, so they spend $10 each on plots.
Including Pearson?
Pearson's there. Hugh Wrong dies in 1954, so he never sees Mike Pearson as PM. Norman Robertson dies in 1968, after Mike has become PM, and Mike dies in 72, and they're all buried beside each other, and their families are as well, and their wives.
It does say something, doesn't it?
It's a beautiful, it sits on the side of a hill. They're all buried there, and it's very moving because it represents their commitment. They weren't soulmates. They were at times competitive. Their relations were sometimes frayed, but they were friends. But having said that, Mike Pearson, for all his sunniness, had deep fears about the world. There's a reason he devotes his retirement to the idea of international assistance in the world. He believes it's important. And he worries about what he would call, in the parlance of the time, thermonuclear war. He worries about it.
I'm speaking with Andrew Cohen, who's the author of Lester B. Pearson, part of the Extraordinary Canadians series put out by Penguin. There's a couple of paragraphs in this book that have me scratching my head. In a way, Pearson's finding a solution to Suez was the worst thing that could have happened to Canada and to its most famous diplomat. Pearson became synonymous with peace. It turned him into a do-gooder, a pacifist on the mountaintop, a saffron-robed priest. His granddaughter Anne Pearson says this is the reason that she is a Baha'i whose teachings are similar to what Lester Pearson espoused. She also thinks that it's paradoxical that Pearson could have helped establish NATO. Today, were he here, he would explain that the purpose of NATO was to keep the peace and protect Western democracy. Suez colored that commitment. In a sense, it denied the history of Canada, which keeps peace when it can, but fights when it must, as it did in 3 big wars in the 20th century at a cost of some 100,000 Canadians.
Scratching your head?
Yeah.
Well, what I'm saying there, Nigel, is that Lester Pearson was never a pacifist. And those who have attempted to hijack his reputation and make him such, and with all due respect to his niece, who became a Baha'i, don't understand him. Lester Pearson believed in peace. He believed in what we call today soft power. Soft power was the power of persuasion and diplomacy. Nobody spent more time in the pursuit of soft power, in the exercise of soft power, in the belief in diplomacy. At the same time, Mike Pearson knew all about hard power. He had, after all, seen war in a way that perhaps all his successors as Prime Minister had not seen war. I mean, Mr. Trudeau didn't see war at all, famously. And others, for various reasons, didn't see war.
And Pearson let nuclear warheads on Canadian soil.
Yes, he did. So what's important to know about Mike Pearson is that he believed in diplomacy, but he also believed in a military. He felt you couldn't have one without the other. That Suez was important, because it established the concept of peacekeeping. There would be no peacekeeping were there not armies to keep the peace, which had to be well armed and well trained.
So it's peacemaking.
Well, there was peacemaking and peacekeeping, peace building.
But would you say that he was more of a peacemaker then?
I would say he was a peacemaker. What I'm saying is he knew there were times when, for example, fighting fascism, he was not Jeanette Rankin in the United States, a pacifist who got up in the House of Representatives after Pearl Harbor and says, we can't fight the Japanese, and that was the end of her. But had been a lifelong, extraordinary pacifist. He was never that way. What I'm saying is, we were both. Under Lester Pearson, we became the world's leading peacekeeper. It was an honorable, useful, important role for us. We comprised 10% of the world's peacekeepers. We led it, we funded it. At the same time, we had what was called the finest small army in the world. An army of about 125,000, which would make it 50,000 bigger than it is today. That was of use if we needed it. And he felt we did need it in Korea.
Kind of a velvet hammer.
There are those who think of us solely in terms of peacekeeping and think that's all Mike Pearson did, but they misread the man. Now, having said that, he opted out, he opposed Vietnam. He said, we're not going, and we didn't go.
And he got strung up on his lapels.
He did, by Lyndon Johnson. So what I'm saying to you is that Suez is a proud moment for Canada, but it would be a mistake to exaggerate the role of peacekeeping. We had far more forces committed to NATO, a Pearson creation, than we did peacekeeping, which I won't call a Pearson creation, but certainly a Pearson instrument or initiative. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that's the difference, I guess, in those two thoughts.
Just winding our conversation down, part of this series, or part of the mandate or the goal of this series, is to get Canadians to look at historical figures in different ways. It's interesting, Pearson led a minority government, and Stephen Harper campaigned on the need for a majority government, and yet look what Pearson achieved with a minority. And yet he was perceived as a befuddled, incompetent leader in many people's eyes. Could you clarify all of this and give us your different perspective on the man?
There are two lessons I think we learn. What good is history if we can't learn from it? One is, had I been Michael Ignatieff, I would have learned how Mike Pearson rebuilt the Liberal Party's opposition leader and led it back to power. It was a lesson, there was a blueprint there for what he did, and we made mention of that earlier. In fact, Michael Ignatieff did read the book and was very complimentary about it. Whether he applied those principles or not, other people can judge.
Quickly, what were some of those principles?
Renewal. Mike Pearson said, look, I don't like John Diefenbaker. He says unkind things to me, but I'm in this for the long haul. Although I'm facing a majority, and although there's no prospect of an election for probably 4 or 5 years because no majority government is going to call one earlier, I'm committed to this. So what am I going to do? I'm going to renew the party intellectually and have the Kingston Conference in 1960. I'm going to hire that guy called Keith Davey, that very sharp advertising man in Toronto, and I'm going to give him a mandate to reorganize the structure of the party, its finances, its organization. And I'm going to be okay if he brings in people like Lou Harris, the American pollster, who the Kennedys were using. And I'm not going to be upset if he walks around with a copy of The Making of the President, 1960, which was Teddy White's book, which became almost a manual, a guide.
And I'm going to move to the left.
I'm going to move to the left, and I'm going to be innovative in policy. I'm going to get out ahead on bilingualism because I have to understand that. I'm not going to be afraid to reverse our policy on nuclear warheads. I may be called the unfrocked Prince of Peace by that guy, Pierre Trudeau, who's running Cité Libre in Quebec, but I think he's a pretty good guy, and I'm going to recruit him along with Jean Peltier and Jean Marchand, who will be one will be a future prime minister, one will be central cabinet ministers, and I'm going to recruit people like John Turner, another prime minister, and I'm going to recruit Jean Chrétien, another prime minister. I'm going to recruit Mitchell Sharp and Eugene Whalen and Barney Danson and Walter Gordon, and all these people are going to become the future of the Liberal Party.
And he can do that because he's so what?
Because he was imaginative and energetic. In 1962, he gives a speech which, this is a person from lily white English Canada who said something is happening in Quebec and I better recognize what that something is. I don't speak French, but I realize bilingualism is important. I read it, but I don't really speak it, and I need to understand what's happening in Quebec. And so I'm going to bring in, and équipe de tonnerre was Jean Lesage's term, but I'm going to bring in my own people from Quebec. He does all this, and he gets it. So by 1962, he takes the Diefenbaker down to minority. In 1963, he doesn't win a majority. He never wins a majority. Mike Pearson was a terrible campaigner. He often, almost always started higher than he ended. And so in 58, in 62, 63, and 65, where he's assured by Keith Davey in 65, having been Prime Minister for 2 years, you're going to get a majority, he still falls 3 seats short. So one of the lessons is Pearson is opposition leader and what you can do. But the second is what you can do with a minority parliament. Because as you've just said, Prime Minister Harper always said, I can't do anything. Well, if you look at the record of Mike Pearson, and I admit times were different, and it did have the support of a very like-minded New Democratic Party. In fact, there were discussions in 1965 about a merger between the New Democrats and the Liberals. And Vincent Lamb, I think, refers to it in his biography in this series on Tommy Douglas. They were, the NDP agreed, and the Conservative Party was split, and the Quebec wing was trending. But what did we get in those years? We got a new flag, which was all Mike Pearson's doing, frankly. And
identity. Yeah.
John Diefenbaker opposed that.
Yeah, there's a great line again. Another one of your lovely short squibs where you say Diefenbaker cried, Pearson smiled.
Well, the day, February 15th, 1965, the flag is being raised on the Peace Tower. Poor Mike Pearson is down with the flu. He didn't even want to come, but he had to show up. Diefenbaker resisted this. He tied it up in the House of Commons as long as he could. And there's a wonderful story of Mike Pearson announcing it, and this is political courage. Mike Pearson could have put out a press release. He could have gone before the Liberal Convention to announce this flag. He goes to the Royal Canadian Legion in Winnipeg, and you can watch this on YouTube or the CBC archives and see he was booed. He was booed when he said, we're going to change the flag, and a lot of leather-lunged veterans. And he said, I'm a veteran too. I fought. And there was a lot of opposition. And let nobody think in this country that change comes easily, and it just happened. It didn't just happen. The flag was a bataille royale. It went on, but it's Mike Pearson, and he does it in a minority parliament. He does a whole number of other things. Medicare. He does the Canada Pension Plan. He establishes the Order of Canada. He establishes the right to strike in the public sector. He establishes aid to students. He puts new emphasis on immigration. A lot happens, and it is true that he had scandal, not personal scandal, but his Quebec MPs got into trouble, and there were a lot of resignations. And there was a feeling which Peter Newman, the great chronicler of this era, both in Renegade and Power and The Distemper of Our Times, and I can't say enough good things about my friend Peter Newman because his journalism, and I say this having spent my years covering the Hill, his journalism was without equal. Matchless journalism. He catches all this. But the one thing I think, and he and I would disagree, and I have the advantage of looking back at this, which he didn't, is I think that while the captain of the ship seemed adrift and the captain seemed befuddled, and while this was happening, they're legislating. Things are going on. In other words, while there are resignations and while Lucien Rouvard is in jail and escaping and while the Munsinger case is breaking, he's legislating. He is moving ahead with an idea of Canada. It doesn't seem like there's a plan. And his reputation suffers after because he doesn't have a name like the Great Society or the Just Society. It's not all wrapped up with a red ribbon.
What I got from this is that he pretty well sets the table for Trudeau.
He does.
To take all the credit.
He does. Well, I don't think Trudeau takes all the credit. I mean, there are many.
He's not taking it, but he gets.
Mike knew, Pearson knew that things in Quebec were changing, and he supported Trudeau. And by the way, many people who love Mike Pearson don't like when I tell them that Mike Pearson supported Trudeau. How could he support Trudeau? I said, because he respected Trudeau. Trudeau wasn't always nice to him, by the way. I mean, Trudeau was insensitive, and there's Mike was a man of the House and had been in the House 20 years, and Trudeau dissolved Parliament so quickly that there were no tributes to Mike Pearson. And he writes in his diary that day, tough day. he wanted to go out with, the kudos of the House. But Mike he had an enormous sense of balance, an emotional, temperamental balance, and he got by it. And he didn't like when Trudeau reviewed his foreign policy. And in 1970, we have it. He scribbles in the margins of the white paper, and it's 6 different pamphlets. And he says, what's going on here? What's wrong with the foreign policy that I had? So there was a bit of insensitivity, but he knew that for the long game, they needed a guy who would throw harder and faster, and it was Pierre Trudeau.
He's a team player.
Yeah, and also, people don't like to admit as well that while they consider Mike the great federalist and the accommodationist, that was only in his first 2 years as Prime Minister. By 1965, when Trudeau arrives in Ottawa with Marchand and Pelletier, they take a much tougher line in Quebec and they say, we are no longer going to handle... Quebec was demanding the whole field of social policy, and Pearson says, sorry, I'm not doing... under the pushing of Trudeau. He was a diplomat. John English will tell you in his very... By the way, and I should acknowledge John English's fine 2-volume work, on which many of works like mine and others are built, and we don't ever claim to be definitive. Our purpose here, Nigel, is to not rescue from obscurity, because Lester Pearson is not obscure, but is to give this person more celebrity and more fame than recognition than an airport where you missed your flight or you lost your bags in Toronto. In other words, you as Canadians, and in a country in which we don't talk about our leaders, you as Canadians should understand that this was one of the builders of modern Canada. Very much today, this is Pearson's Canada. The Canada you see today of the social welfare state. For years after, we don't do peacekeeping anymore, but Stephen Harper may want to turn his back on that, but he's not going to revoke Medicare. He's not going to repeal pensions. He's not going to erase an image of Canada as internationalist. Although, you could argue that our stature in the UN, Mike Pearson would be appalled today by our stature at the UN. But that having been said, it's very much Pearson's Canada still today.
Perhaps we could end with you reading the last paragraph of your book.
When it was over, his body lay in an oak coffin draped with a maple leaf in the Parliament of Canada. The Royal Canadian Legion, whose members had once jeered him, sent him a spray of poppies. 12,000 people filed past. He had a state funeral at which mourners from around the world sang hymns and read psalms. On December 31st, under gunmetal skies and a veil of rain, they carried him to a pioneer cemetery above the village of Wakefield in the Gatineau Hills, where he had rambled with Norman Robertson and Hume Wrong and imagined a better world. There he was buried beside him. He would be joined by Marion in 1989 and Jeffrey in 2008. Today the maple leaf flutters from a tall flagpole. The cemetery lies near the top of a hill, falling softly to a thick stand of trees. They say years ago, when those trees were shorter, you could see the Peace Tower. They say, on a quiet day, you could hear the murmur of its bells. Neither is so today. From where he rests, though, the skies are always sunny, and the view is always fair, especially the gentle meadow in the middle distance.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
I've been speaking with Andrew Cohen, who is the author of Lester B. Pearson, part of the Extraordinary Canadian series published by Penguin. And you're currently working on...
Currently working on a book on 2 days in the administration of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, where his world changes dramatically. And the 2 biggest issues of the 1960s, nuclear arms and civil rights, commingle and collide. And his administration reaches a moral tipping point at which he has to make big decisions. And he does.
We'll look forward to that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.